In the summer of 1940, while war consumed Europe and the Pacific teetered on the edge of chaos, a team of engineers at WWII sat in a cramped design office in Stratford, Connecticut, staring at the blueprint of something that looked almost impossible: a fighter that could outrun anything in the sky, take off from a carrier deck, and bring its pilot home again. At its center was a monster of an engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial capable of 2,000 horsepower. No carrier aircraft had ever handled that much power before. To tame it, Chief Engineer Rex Beazle and his team sketched a radical solution: the now famous inverted gull wing that dipped down where the landing gear attached, giving the Corsair its unmistakable shape. The design wasn't just aesthetic, it was mathematical necessity. The R2800's 13-foot 4-inch propeller was so huge that without those bent wings, the blades would strike the carrier deck. When the prototype, labeled XF4U1, rolled out of the hangar on May 29, 1940, it didn't look like a naval aircraft. Its fuselage was sleek and elongated, its wings wide and predatory. Mechanics called it the bent-wing bird, but the engineers had another name for it: the Corsair. On its first high-speed run, the test pilot, Lyman Bullard, pushed the throttle forward and felt something no carrier pilot had ever felt before: acceleration like a punch to the chest. The prototype screamed down the runway, wheels barely touching the tarmac, and broke through 400 miles per hour, 404 miles per hour officially, making it the first U.S. Navy fighter to exceed that barrier. The engineers cheered. Newspapers called it the fastest naval fighter in the world. But as the saying went, what goes up must come down. During landing tests at the Vought field strip, the Corsair revealed its first and deadliest flaw. When Bullard brought it in for touchdown at 85 knots, the aircraft hit the ground, compressed its heavy landing gear, then instead of absorbing the impact, bounced violently back into the air. The massive propeller bit into the dirt, the left wing dipped, and the plane slewed sideways before coming to a stop in a shower of dust and profanity. Bullard climbed out shaken but alive. "She flies like an angel," he said grimly, "and lands like a devil." Beazle and his team replayed the test footage frame by frame. The problem wasn't the wings, or the propeller, or the engine. It was the landing gear, the very component that had made the gull wing design possible. Each strut was short and stiff to fit within the curve of the wing, giving almost no travel for shock absorption. When the gear hit the deck, the rebound energy shot straight back into the airframe. On a wide, forgiving runway, a pilot could recover. On a carrier deck barely 500 feet long, it would be a death sentence. Still, Vought pressed on. The Navy wanted performance, and the Corsair delivered. In 1941, test flights over Bridgeport and Hartford dazzled observers. The aircraft could climb faster than the Wildcat, dive like a stone, and reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It was armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and could carry 1,000 pounds of bombs. In a straight line, nothing could touch it. But the engineers couldn't ignore the reports piling up from test pilots. Phrases like hard bounce, severe stall on approach, and dangerous at low speeds. Every landing was a gamble. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, urgency replaced caution. Production began at a fever pitch. By early 1942, the Navy had ordered hundreds of Corsairs, trusting Vought's promise that the landing issue could be refined later. At the same time, the first operational squadrons began forming: VF-112 for the Navy and VMF-124 for the Marine Corps. Their pilots loved the Corsair's speed and hated everything about its landings. The first time you flew one onto a carrier deck, you either stuck it perfectly or you died trying. There wasn't much in between. On practice runs at Norfolk and Patuxent River, the decks became scrapyards of shattered landing gear and twisted propellers. The heavy nose and springy struts turned each touchdown into a coin toss. The aircraft earned new nicknames among the crews: the bent-wing Widowmaker, the Hog, and most memorably, the Ensign Eliminator. The phrase spread through the fleet like dark humor. Ensigns, the Navy's youngest, most experienced pilots, were the most vulnerable. Many never survived their first carrier qualification. Flight instructors watched as the Corsair touched down, rebounded 10 feet into the air, then came down hard on one wheel, veering off the deck or slamming into the crash barrier. One test report from early 1942 simply read, "Aircraft departed deck after bounce. Pilot lost. Recommend immediate redesign." For Vought's engineers, it was a nightmare. Every improvement in power and speed only made the landings worse. The heavier the engine, the greater the inertia on touchdown. The The faster the approach, the harder the impact. The Navy began to lose faith. By mid-1942, officials quietly shifted new Corsair deliveries away from carrier squadrons to the Marines, who could operate from land bases in the South Pacific. It was a humiliating setback, a plane built for the Navy that the Navy itself couldn't use. Beazle and his team refused to give up. They knew the problem could be solved. It just needed time, patience, and courage, and they were running out of all three. The Corsair was a marvel of design, but it had become the victim of its own ambition. As the engineers watched the production line fill hangars with fighters that couldn't yet fly safely the sea, one of them muttered, "We built a thoroughbred for the sky and gave it the legs of a mule." By mid-1942, the F-4U Corsair had become a paradox, the most advanced naval fighter ever built, and yet one that couldn't safely return to the ship it launched from. To Navy brass, the contradiction was intolerable. To the pilots who flew it, it was terrifying. The same design that made the Corsair a speed demon in the air turned it into a trap during landing. Its enormous propeller demanded long landing gear, but the inverted gull wing forced those legs to be short and stiff, absorbing impact poorly. Every time the plane's wheels hit a deck, the rebound would throw the nose upward. The result was a sickening bounce that no amount of skill could fully predict. The tests became a grim ritual. The Navy's carrier qualification program at NAS Patuxent River, Maryland, saw one Corsair after another come apart on landing. Pilots described the same horror over and over, the deck rushing up, the wheels slamming down, and then the aircraft launching back into the air as if it refused to land. Some managed to throttle up and go around again, others weren't so lucky. One report dated November 1942 reads, "Plane touchdown, starboard side, rebounded 10 feet, drifted left, struck barrier. Pilot deceased." The engineering teams from VOT and the Bureau of Aeronautics gathered in the observation gallery, helplessly watching another test end in disaster. The Corsair had been meant to replace the aging F-4F Wildcat and dominate the Pacific. Instead, it was being called the Ensign Eliminator in every ready room. Even experienced pilots dreaded its return to the deck. Lieutenant Bill Brewer, one of the Navy's top test pilots, summed it up bluntly in his flight log: "The Corsair kills better than it fights." At the same time, in the South Pacific, the U.S. Marine Corps was begging for fighters that could match the Japanese Zero. Commanders in the Solomon Islands didn't care about bounce or deck landings. Their airfields were dirt and coral. They needed speed, range, and firepower, and the Corsair had all three. In early 1943, Marine squadrons like VMF 124 began flying Corsairs from land bases on Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo. To them, it was salvation. To the Navy, it was exile. The plane designed for carrier decks had been banished to the shore. Meanwhile, at Vought's Stratford plant, the mood turned grim. Engineers pored over slow-motion film reels of carrier landings. They watched frame by frame as the Corsair's gear flexed, rebounded, and flung the plane back upward. The motion wasn't symmetrical. On most flights, the right landing gear seemed to strike harder than the left, twisting the airframe slightly. That twist, combined with the Corsair's long nose and poor forward visibility, made it nearly impossible for pilots to correct before disaster. Chief Engineer Rex Beisel slammed his fist against the drafting table. "It's not the pilot," he said to his staff. "It's the gear. One side's fighting the other." Test pilot Lyman Bullard, now flying production models off mock decks in Connecticut, agreed. "You can feel it," he told Beisel. "The right strut kicks harder. The plane jerks sideways. Once she bounces, you're just along for the ride." The team began experimenting with changes to tire pressure, hydraulic damping, and spring tension. Nothing worked. The Corsair was too heavy, too powerful, and too fast for the small deck space it was meant to land on. On January 25, 1943, the Navy issued an internal memorandum. Until further notice, the F-4U Corsair is unsuitable for carrier operation. The blow was devastating. The Navy would instead rely on Grumman's new F-6F Hellcat, a slower but more forgiving design. For the first time, the future of the Corsair program hung by a thread. "We've built a masterpiece that can't go home," Beisel said that night to his assistant, A.B. Baker, staring across the production floor. "If we can't make her land, she's finished." But not everyone had given up. At Patuxent River, a small joint team of Navy engineers and Vought technicians continued their tests, led by Lieutenant Commander George Lockwood, an ordnance officer turned aerodynamics expert. They mounted cameras under the deck to film each landing from below, measuring rebound height and strut compression. The results confirmed what Beisel suspected. The right landing gear was stiffer, meaning it returned force faster than the left. When the wheels hit, the right side pushed the aircraft upward and leftward, starting the deadly bounce. Lockwood scribbled in his notebook, "Right gear must delay rebound by 0.2 seconds, re-engineer or dampen." It sounded simple, but the fix wasn't. The Corsair's gear retraction system was a complex, folding mechanism that rotated 90 degrees to fit inside the wing. Altering its geometry required changing the angle of the shock strut, something no one dared to attempt mid-production. But the alternative was worse, grounding the Navy's fastest fighter indefinitely. Over the next few months, the engineers turned the bounce into an obsession. They tested different oleo pressures, nitrogen then hydraulic mixtures, to find a combination that absorbed impact without firing back like a spring. They adjusted the strut's pivot point by fractions of an inch, reshaping metal housings by hand. Test flights went out every week. Sometimes 2 Corsairs were wrecked in a day. The pilots joked darkly about volunteering for Beisel's bungee jumpers. Then, in June 1943, during a test at Stratford's grass strip, something remarkable happened. Bullard brought in the prototype, number Buno 02270, on final approach. The wheels touched, flexed, and held. The plane bounced once, lightly, then settled. The right gear absorbed its hit cleanly. The Corsair rolled to a stop. Silence fell over the field. One of the engineers dropped his clipboard and laughed out loud. "It stayed down," he shouted. "It finally stayed down." The change that made it possible seemed almost trivial on paper. The right landing strut's internal valve was redesigned to slow its rebound, reducing its stiffness by 15%. Combined with a small tweak to the wheel alignment and tire pressure, the modification transformed the aircraft's behavior. For the first time, the Corsair behaved like it wanted to stay on the deck. But that success came at a cost. The modifications were expensive, time-consuming, and required retrofitting hundreds of aircraft already built. Worse, the war couldn't wait. The Marines were begging for more planes in the Pacific, and factories were under pressure to deliver. The Navy still refused to clear the Corsair for carrier service. So while the Beisel and Lockwood celebrated a quiet technical victory, their masterpiece remained grounded at sea. The Corsair was still too wild for the deck, too precious for the scrap heap. In Washington, one admiral summarized the problem perfectly in a single sentence. "The F4U flies like a champion and lands like a lawsuit." Yet, the engineers refused to stop. They had proven the flaw could be fixed. All that remained was convincing the Navy that the beast could be tamed, and that the most feared bounce in aviation could at last be conquered. By the summer of 1943, the F4U Corsair had earned its reputation, the fastest naval fighter in the world, and the most dangerous to land. Its beauty was treacherous, an aircraft that could climb through cloud like a bullet, then betray its pilot in the final 3 seconds before touchdown. At Voogt's Stratford Airfield, engineers worked around the clock, refusing to let 2 years of design genius end in failure. They had already found the problem, the asymmetry in the right landing gear's rebound. The challenge now was convincing the Navy that it could be fixed without redesigning the entire airplane. In August, Rex Beasel arrived in Washington with a stack of test films, diagrams, and one question written in pencil across the top sheet: "Will you trust us to fix the beast?" The Bureau of Aeronautics was skeptical. The Navy already had the F-6F Hellcat, which could land on a carrier as docile as a trainer. Why gamble on the Corsair again? But Beasel argued that the F-4U was faster, climbed higher, and had double the range, traits that could decide the war in the Pacific. He promised a full solution within 90 days. "If it fails," he told the board, "I'll kill the program myself." Back at Stratford, the team turned their hangar into a laboratory of controlled violence. They built a wooden mock-up of a carrier deck and dropped Corsair fuselages from cranes, simulating touchdowns at different speeds and weights. Each time, high-speed cameras filmed the landing gear compress and rebound. The walls were plastered with sketches and equations. The air smelled of oil and scorched metal. Lyman Bullard, the test pilot who had first tamed the prototype, joked grimly, "We're learning to make a plane crash, politely." The solution that emerged wasn't elegant. It was practical. Engineers modified the right landing gear strut with a redesigned shock absorber valve that delayed its rebound by 0.2 a second. This small delay allowed the left gear to finish compressing before the right began its upward push, neutralizing the side hop that had launched so many Corsairs off the deck. They also reduced the nitrogen pressure inside both struts from 800 to 650 psi, softening the impact. Finally, they added a restrictor in the hydraulic return line, forcing the landing gear to bleed off energy more gradually. Each adjustment meant hours of machining, testing, and swearing. On some nights, the hangar glowed like a forge, torches cutting metal while snow fell silently outside. The men began to call themselves the deck doctors. Their unofficial motto, scrawled on the wall in chalk, read, "What goes up must stay down." The first full-scale test of the modified landing gear came on October 17, 1943. Bullard took off from Stratford in Corsair Buno 17792, painted navy blue, polished to a mirror. As he lined up for approach, the wind gusted across the field. It was the kind of crosswind that once would have doomed the attempt. The crew held their breath. The Corsair descended, wheels kissed the ground, and it didn't bounce. The right strut flexed, absorbed, and stayed compressed. The plane rolled to a perfect stop, tail down, wings level. Bissell exhaled for the first time in hours. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we've built a carrier fighter." Over the next month, the modifications were tested again and again. At NAS Patuxent River, Navy pilots, skeptical and scarred from earlier accidents, were invited to fly the new Corsair. One by one, they landed cleanly. The reports stunned the Bureau of Aeronautics. Improved handling on touchdown, reduced bounce tendency, carrier suitability restored. Even so, the skepticism lingered. "The Corsairs killed too many good men," one officer warned Bissell. "You can't fix a reputation with a wrench." But Bissell knew that numbers spoke louder than fear. The data was irrefutable. The average rebound height had dropped from 8 feet to less than 2, and directional drift was nearly eliminated. In November, the Navy authorized the first sea trials aboard USS Sangamon CVE-26, a Casablanca-class escort carrier operating off Norfolk. The decks were short, the seas rough. The pilots called it flying into a postage stamp. The first to go was Lieutenant Mel Castle, an old Hellcat veteran who didn't trust the Corsair as far as I could throw it. On his first attempt, he lined up, came in a little hot, and touched down. The plane skipped once, just a few inches, then settled smoothly. He taxied forward, engines idling, and pulled off his goggles. I'll be damned, she finally learned to behave. The flight deck erupted in applause. The legend of the bouncing Corsair was beginning to fade. Word spread quickly through the fleet and factories alike. At Voot, machinists who had worked in silence for months now cheered every telegram from Patuxent River. In the Pacific, Marine pilots flying from land bases heard rumors that their beloved but exiled fighter was coming home, to the carriers it was born for. But victory didn't erase the scars. The list of test pilots lost to the bounce filled an entire wall in Bissell's office. Names like Ensign Walter Erickson, Lieutenant J.G. Henry Hank Adams, and dozens more. Each had contributed to the knowledge that now saved others. Bissell refused to take the list down. He paid for this fix, he told Torres, now a Voot maintenance chief. We can least remember their names. By December 1943, production lines incorporated the redesigned right strut and new hydraulic settings. The Navy officially rescinded its restriction. The F4U Corsair was again cleared for carrier operations. The decision came too late for many of its doubters, but just in time for the next stage of the Pacific War. The engineers didn't celebrate with champagne. They celebrated by watching one last test, Bullett's final landing at Stratford before deployment. The plane came in fast, touched down, and stayed glued to the earth. As the wheels rolled to a stop, the sound of metal on asphalt was replaced by something almost reverent: silence. Bissell turned to his team, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but smiling. 2 years, he said softly. 2 years to teach a machine how to land. It had cost hundreds of test flights, millions of dollars, and more lives than any of them cared to count. But the beast, as pilots called it, was finally tamed. And soon, the Pacific would feel its roar. By January 1944, the news had reached every hangar, every ready room, every deck where the Corsair had once been cursed. The beast was coming home. After nearly 2 years of exile to Marine airfields, the F4U had been cleared for full carrier operations. Across the Navy's Pacific Fleet, mechanics and pilots gathered around the new blueprints, revised right landing strut, softened hydraulic damping, and a set of operating notes stamped "Approved for carrier use." For the first time since its creation, the Corsair could finally do what it had been born to do: launch from a carrier, fight, and return safely to the deck. On April 3, 1944, aboard USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, the Corsair's redemption was about to be tested in combat conditions. The sea was calm, the air humid, the deck crew tense. Lieutenant Commander Tom Blackburn, leader of the Navy's VF-17 Jolly Rogers, stood by the island tower, watching as the first Corsair lined up for approach. The pilot, Lieutenant Bill Brooks, had flown the older, deadly versions during early tests and still carried the scars of its bounce, literally a long white line down his jaw from a canopy-shattering incident months earlier. "Bring her home easy, Bill," Blackburn said over the radio. "She's not the same wild girl she used to be." Brooks descended through the morning haze, nose angled high, tail dancing slightly in the slipstream. The new struts flexed. The plane touched down, firm, solid. The right gear took the hit, compressed and held, no bounce, no sudden lurch. The Corsair rolled straight down the deck, caught the third arresting wire cleanly, and stopped dead. The crew erupted in cheers. For a moment, even the ocean seemed to pause. "Smooth as butter," Brooks radioed, voice breaking into a grin. "Tell Beisel the witch is cured." Within days, VF-17 was joined by VF-84 aboard USS Bunker Hill, marking the first full-scale carrier deployment of the F-4U Corsair. The transformation was complete. The same fighter, once called the Ensign Eliminator, was now the Navy's pride, faster than the Hellcat, tougher than any fighter Japan could field, and devastating in a dive. The once feared bounce had vanished, replaced by unshakable stability. Pilots who had once dreaded landing now spoke of the Corsair with affection, half respect, half awe. Lieutenant Ira Kepford, one of the Navy's top aces, described it best. "She's still got teeth, but now she bites for you, not at you." On deck, maintenance crews marveled at how the aircraft could take punishment and still come home. Bullet holes were patched, engines swapped, struts greased, but the landings stayed steady. The new hydraulic dampers and strut redesign held up even under brutal combat tempo. For Vought, the data pouring back from the fleet was vindication. Years of ridicule had turned into reverence. In Washington, Beisel received a brief telegram from the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. "F-4U Corsair carrier operations successful. Congratulations. The beast is tamed." He pinned it to the wall above his desk and didn't say a word. Around him, his team celebrated with black coffee and exhaustion. For the men who had spent nights hunched over blueprints and test footage, this quiet note meant more than medals. It was proof that persistence, mechanical, human, and moral, had triumphed. By late 1944, the Corsair was everywhere. From Okinawa to Formosa, from the Marianas Turkey Shoot to the raids over the Philippines, its distinct silhouette became a symbol of vengeance and endurance. Marine squadrons flew it low over jungle battlefields, strafing convoys and bunkers. Navy squadrons launched it from carriers to escort bombers and dual Zeros at 30,000 feet. On board USS Exus, a young pilot named Jim Caldwell wrote in his diary, "We used to fear the deck. Now it feels like home. Every time the hook catches, I think about the men who fixed her. They gave us back our landings, and maybe our lives." Not every flight ended cleanly, of course. The Pacific was unforgiving, and war never waited for perfection. Crosswinds still played tricks, engines still failed, and pilots still made mistakes. But the deadly bounce was gone. The Corsair had finally found its rhythm. In November 1944, during a refit stop at Pearl Harbor, engineers measured stress loads on the new landing gear. The results stunned them. The redesigned strut reduced rebound force by 47%, cutting landing accidents to nearly zero. The solution that had seemed almost heretical a year before was now official Navy doctrine. Even so, Beisel never forgot what it had cost to get there. In a rare interview after the war, he said quietly, "It wasn't just metal we were testing. It was men. Every crash we taught us something, but it also took someone. That's the debt you never stop paying." By the time 1944 drew to a close, the Corsair had become what it was always meant to be, a carrier-born predator, graceful in the air and obedient to the deck. From its roaring climb to its whispering landings,
It embodied the transformation of American aviation, from improvisation to mastery. As USS Bunker Hill sailed west toward the final battles of the Pacific, its decks lined with dark blue Corsairs shimmering in the sunset, the ship's log recorded a simple entry. F4U aircraft operations. Normal. No bounces reported. It was an unremarkable sentence, yet it marked the end of a 2-year war between man and machine. The beast had come home.
When the war ended in August 1945, the skies over the Pacific finally fell silent. The great fleets that had carried America across 2 oceans lay at anchor, their decks lined with rows of dark blue Corsairs. On USS Bunker Hill, mechanics stood beside aircraft that had survived dozens of landings, each one a small victory over the ghosts of the past. For them, every scratch in the paint, every dented panel, was a reminder of how close they had come to losing not just a machine, but a generation of pilots. The Corsair's story didn't end with Japan's surrender. In many ways, its second life was just beginning. Even as the world demobilized, the Navy and Marine Corps realized that this fighter, once dismissed as uncontrollable, had become indispensable. It flew on through the late 1940s, served in the Korean War, and remained in production until 1953, long after its contemporaries had faded into museums and scrapyards. At Vaught's plant in Stratford, Connecticut, a small brass plaque was mounted near the assembly line. It read simply, "In memory of those who taught the Corsair to land." Underneath were the names of 37 test pilots and engineers who had died perfecting the design. Rex Basel visited the factory one last time in 1946. The war had aged him, but when he stood before the plaque, he smiled faintly. "It was never the plane's fault," he said quietly to a reporter. "It was ours, for believing that perfection comes without pain." The Corsair's rebirth reshaped naval aviation forever. The landing gear geometry perfected in 1943 became the blueprint for every carrier aircraft that followed, from the F-99 Panther to the F-8 Crusader and even the F-14 Tomcat 3 decades later. The principle was simple but hard-earned. The deck, not the air, is the ultimate test of a fighter. Every hydraulic damper, every shock strut on modern jets carries a trace of the lesson learned from those brutal Corsair bounces. In 1951, during the height of the Korean War, Corsairs returned to combat, this time from carriers without fear. Over the Sea of Japan, they dove on enemy positions, launched rockets, and pulled up effortlessly into the clouds. Pilots who hadn't been born when the first prototypes flew now wrote home about the easiest carrier fighter I've ever landed. One Marine, Captain Jesse Falmar, even shot down a Soviet-built MiG-15 jet in his F-4U, a propeller-driven relic defeating the future itself. Back at home, in airshows and museums, restored Corsairs began to appear. At NAS Patuxent River, where the landing tests had once claimed lives, one gleaming blue Corsair was rolled onto the tarmac in 1954 for display. On its right landing gear, a small silver plate was engraved with Basil's words, 0.2 of a second, life or death. Visitors rarely noticed it, but for those who did, it was a window into the war's quieter heroism, the kind fought not in dogfights, but on drafting tables and test fields in grease-stained hangars filled with the smell of burned rubber and oil. The men who had tamed the Corsair went on to design America's next generation of aircraft. George Lockwood became a consultant for the Bureau of Aeronautics. Lyman Bullard retired from flight testing in 1947 and taught aerodynamics at MIT. And Sam Torres, the old mechanic who had once joked that "we built a champion with mule legs," worked at Chance Vaughant's new Dallas plant, training apprentices who had grown up idolizing the plane he had once cursed. Every landing, he told his students, is a conversation between gravity and forgiveness. The Corsair just made you listen harder. By the 1960s, jet engines had rendered propeller fighters obsolete. But the legend of the Corsair refused to die. Hollywood rediscovered it in the TV series Baa Baa Black Sheep, dramatizing the exploits of Poppy Boyington and his Black Sheep Squadron. Children watched the bent-wing bird roar across their screens, never realizing how many years it had taken to make that flight look effortless.
In reality, Boyington himself had once struggled with the Corsair's early bounce, crashing one during training in 1943. When he heard of the fix that saved it, he reportedly said, "Took 'em long enough. That bird was worth the pain." Today, if you visit the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, you'll find a Corsair suspended from the ceiling, its midnight blue paint glinting under the lights. Beneath the wings, the gull-like curves still catch the air, elegant and defiant. On its landing gear, barely visible behind the display ropes, sits a replica of the modified right strut, still angled slightly differently from the left. It's a small, almost invisible detail, but for the engineers who know where to look, it tells an entire story. A failure turned to perseverance of how one fraction of a second changed the course of aviation history. In 1978, Rex Basel, then 80 years old, stood on the deck of the restored USS Yorktown, now a museum ship. Beside him, a retired pilot guided him toward a Corsair painted in wartime markings. "She still looks wild," the pilot said. Basel nodded. "She always was," he replied, resting a hand on the cool blue metal. "We just learned to land her without fear." As the sun dipped behind the mast, the sky turned the same shade of steel blue as the plane's wings. Basel closed his eyes and smiled. "Every great aircraft is born twice," he said softly. "First in ambition, then in humility." The Corsair had been both. And in every perfect carrier landing since 1944, every moment when metal kissed steel and stayed down, there lingers the echo of that once deadly flaw, and the brilliance of those who refused to let it end the story. The bounce that killed pilots became the lesson that saved generations.